Today we have a thrilling game from the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz. This was played in the rapid portion. Caruana with the white pieces, Alireza Firouzja with black. 25 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. And this is a classic castle on opposite sides. Throw all your pieces and pawns at your opponent's king game. A real pleasure to watch. I know you're going to enjoy it. Let us jump right in. Caruana began with e4. Firouzja plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and knight to f6. The Berlin defense is played by Alireza, and here d3 is played by Caruana. Now, they have played this position quite a bit with each other, and so far, Firouzja has done well with the black pieces in this structure. Let's see if that happens again. Bishop to c5 is played. d6 is another option, of course. Bishop takes knight, dc6, and it looks like white is threatening to capture the pawn on e5, but we know that if he were to do that, queen d4 would come, threatening mate as well as the knight on e5, so he doesn't do that. Instead, he plays h3 to keep a piece out of the g4 square. Now queen to e7. What Alireza is doing with this move, obviously the queen is defending e5, but he's also clearing out the back rank so he can castle long if he chooses to. Knight to c3, bishop to d7, continuing that clearing out of the queen side so that he can castle on that side of the board. Queen to e2 from Caruana, and long castle. So in this position, in the past, a3 has been played with the idea of launching an attack with the A and B pawns very quickly. But here Caruana plays bishop to e3, which is a novelty, challenging the bishop at c5, and also aiming that light-squared bishop at black's king. And here, Firouzja decides to avoid the exchange. He uses that bishop to strengthen the e5 pawn, and he wants to keep pieces on the board, and he's not overly concerned, as it turns out, with the bishop's threat against the a7 pawn. Here, a3 was played by Caruana, and I mean, if he takes on a7, then b6, and I mean, the bishop can get in big trouble. But a3 was played with the idea now of playing b4 and attacking on the queen side. King to b8. A standard move when you castle long is to move the king over one square. Now the king is defending a7. Knight to d2. A strong idea from Fabi. Aiming at the c4 square where the knight hits the e5 pawn. It could take off the d6 bishop, and it could also jump into a5 and cause some trouble on that square as well. So Firouzja plays bishop to e6. So if the knight lands on c4, he can just take it off the board and not have to worry about those threats. And now b4 from Caruana. And it looks like white is beginning to generate some real pressure on the queen side. However, something about black structure that we have to look at, these pawns are pretty strong defenders. This king has 4 pawns of protection instead of the normal 3, and it's not so easy for white to break through on the queen side. Firouzja plays g6, and the idea here is to support a knight advance to h5. If it moved there right now, obviously the queen would just capture it. The knight goes to h5 and can hop into f4 and cause some trouble for white on the king side. Rook to b1, backing up the queen side pawn advance. Knight to h5, potentially aiming at this f4 square. He is aiming at the f4 square, potentially landing on it. And castles. So now we have opposite side castling, and the position really becomes a race to see who can get at whose king the fastest. f6 is played by Alireza. Maybe later he can play g5, g4. Rook f to d1 was played by Caruana, and I have to say I'm not exactly sure about this move, what his purpose was. Maybe he was thinking he might tuck the knight back at f1. I'm not sure. The move b5 looks a bit faster for white, though. Rook f to d1, and now queen to f7. Basically, this queen will defend the knight at h5, which means he can go ahead and play g5 and continue the attack with his pawns. And here, he could play knight to c4. That seems like a decent idea. But Caruana plays f3, creating some strength on these light squares, and particularly g4, trying to make it harder for black to break through on that square. The knight jumps into f4 now, hitting the queen at e2, putting some pressure on the g2 pawn. So Caruana plays the queen to f2. Now the queen and bishop are aiming at the a7 pawn, threatening to capture that pawn with check. So black has to do something about that, and Firouzja plays b6, blocking that. One thing he will have to think about, though, as the game progresses, at some point, will white be able to play a demolition sacrifice on b6, give everything up, and then come in on that square with his queen? That's something white might try to generate. And in fact, with his next move, a4, threatening a5, that's exactly what he's trying to do, soften up that b6 square. But now g5 from Alireza, continuing this idea of trying to break through on g4, a5, and h5. The race is on. Neither side is playing defensive moves right now. Both are advancing their attack. Here, white could take on b6, ab6, rook to a1, and maybe this was his better option than in the game. He played bishop takes knight. That's a very nice dark squared bishop, and of course any demolition sacrifices on b6 are pretty much gone now. But the knight was a problem, so he decided to go ahead and get rid of it. And here, Alireza takes with the e-pawn. If he takes with the g-pawn, it would open up the g-file, but this way, his bishop might be able to come in on e5, but also he's now threatening the pawn advance to g4, which is even more devastating than just the file being open. After d4, now the bishop cannot land on e5. He goes ahead and plays g4, continuing his attack, threatening to open up that g-file and create a weak target on h3 as well. So Caruana plays h4, trying to keep the position blocked so that black cannot break through on the king's side. Rook h to g8, putting the rook opposite the king, preparing for that g-file to open. ab6, ab6, and here queen to f1. So the idea with this move, obviously, is rook to a1, queen to a6, queen to a8, mate. Mate in 3 moves. The problem is black is a little faster. Alireza just goes ahead and takes on f3, doesn't play a defensive move, and if white were to continue the plan, say queen to a6, then rook to g2 check, king f1, queen to g6, rook to a1, with the threat of mate on a8, but black would mate first with rook to g1, king f2, queen g2, mate. So that's the problem for white. He goes ahead then and recaptures that pawn with his knight. Bishop to c4, hits the queen at f1. Obviously, the bishop is backed up by black's queen at f7. The queen moves to e1, and now rook to g3, preparing to double or perhaps even triple on the g-file. Rook to d2 defends the g2 pawn laterally, but now rook d to g8, doubling up and also threatening to take the knight because there's a pin on that g-pawn. So Caruana sidesteps the pin, plays king to h1, but now queen to d7. So if this knight were taken, the queen might be able to create a lot of problems on the h3 square. So Caruana plays the king to h2. So if that were to happen, this king would actually cover the h3 square, but Firouzja just sees a flaw in white's thinking. And here it is. He goes ahead and takes the knight anyway, with this exchange sacrifice. After pawn takes rook, it's true the queen can't just move to h3, so Firouzja plays, boom, rook to g3. And now the queen is threatening to come into h3 with checkmate. So Caruana retreats the king so that if the queen comes to h3, he can block that check with his rook on d2. So rook takes f3. Now, not only are threats of the queen coming to h3 on the board, also rook to f1 check, supported by the bishop at c4 attacking the king and the queen. The rook to h2 to prevent the queen coming in, but then rook to f1 check. Gets the queen in exchange for the rook and the bishop. Queen takes, bishop takes, rook takes f1. And now f3. Black attacks the rook on h2. Caruana plays e5. A pawn sacrifice, so after knight to e4, the knight can get rid of that powerful bishop. E d4, knight d6, queen d6, rook f3. So in this endgame, we have 2 rooks against a queen. However, white has a couple of serious problems. Alireza has a much safer king in this position. Also, he's about to win another pawn, and he's going to have a lot of pawns over Caruana here. Queen takes b4, grabbing a third pawn. rook h to f2, queen to e1 check, king g2, now queen to e4, pinning that rook at f3. So king to f1, sidestepping the pin. Queen takes h4, winning another pawn. King to e2 and c5, and now he has this nice, strong constellation of pawns on the queen side. King to d3, king to b7, rook to f1, queen to g4, rook to f7, and now h4. Alireza begins to advance that h-pawn. Rook 1 to f4 harasses the queen to g6 check. King has to move, king to d2, and h3. And in this position, Fabiano Caruana resigned. And this is a very likely continuation. If he had played rook to f1 to control the queening square, then h2, rook 7 to f2, then queen to h6 check is the problem. And after the king moves, black will go ahead and queen, and then white would lose another rook because he would have to give that up for the queen. A very nice attacking game from Alireza Firouzja, really that kind of juicy opposite side castling position that we all love. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.